He wore a simple suit, nothing fancy, nothing proud, just a plain gray coat, a decade old, with sleeves that had seen more countries than most guests in that wedding hall. But to everyone there, he was the failure. It was supposed to be a day of joy, his sister's wedding, music, laughter, proud speeches. Yet somehow it turned into his father's stage of humiliation. "Look at him," the old man said, glass in hand and pride in his tone, 33 years old and still nothing to show for his life. The crowd chuckled, polite laughter that hurt more than open mockery. Even the band seemed to pause as if the sound of that insult had stolen their rhythm. He stood there, smiling faintly, like a soldier taking a hit without flinching. No one noticed how steady his breathing was, how his hands didn't tremble. They mistook composure for shame, not realizing it came from discipline. Because what they didn't know was that just a week ago, those same hands had signed a NATO-level operations report, one that had saved dozens of lives overseas. But tonight, he was just the invisible son. The one who didn't fit the family photo, and in a hall full of glitter, gossip, and gold jewelry, nothing shines less than a man who doesn't flaunt his success. He quietly took a seat at the back table, far from the laughter, close to the exit. That's where people like him usually sit. The embarrassments, the black sheep. Little did they know that very seat was about to be reserved by someone far bigger than any of them, because life has a strange way of flipping the script. Sometimes the one mocked in public becomes the one the world salutes in private, and when that moment comes, the same crowd that once laughed turns silent. That night, he didn't defend himself. He didn't shout, argue, or explain. He just smiled, and in that smile hid 1,000 unspoken stories, stories that began long before this wedding. So, how did a man go from being his father's disappointment to being personally escorted by NATO Command? Let's rewind. Before the insults, before the medals, before the silence. Let's go back to where it all started. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege, just a small-town boy from Kentucky, where hard work was the only currency people truly respected. His name was Ethan Cole, and from the outside, his family looked perfect. A proud father who ran a small hardware store, a gentle mother who believed in quiet strength, and 2 kids, Ethan and his younger sister, Lily, who were supposed to carry the family name forward. But what people didn't see was the invisible line that always divided that home, the line between expectation and disappointment. His father, Charles Cole, was a man who measured worth in trophies, promotions, and how loudly the neighbors talked about you. And Ethan? He was the quiet type. More heart than show, more action than words. While other boys bragged about touchdowns, Ethan was the one helping an old neighbor fix a roof or spending weekends reading about world history and strategy. He wanted to serve not just a company, not just a paycheck, but something greater. When he told his father he planned to join the military after college, the old man laughed. "Son, you don't even have the backbone to lead a backyard barbecue and you're talking about commanding soldiers?" That sentence carved itself deep into Ethan's chest, a scar that never quite faded. Still, he went ahead. He trained, studied, worked late-night shifts at a diner just to pay for his courses, and joined the ROTC program. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere, among people who didn't care where you came from, only how much heart you had. But life, as it often does, tested him hard and early. His mother fell ill, a slow, unforgiving illness that drained their savings and broke their peace. Ethan was deployed overseas when she passed away. He couldn't even attend the funeral. The one person who believed in him left quietly without getting to hear, "Mom, I made it." His father blamed him for it, said he'd chosen adventure over family. And from that day forward, every call home was colder, shorter, angrier, yet Ethan didn't stop serving. In Afghanistan, he led a small NATO tactical communications unit, the kind of team that worked in silence, far from cameras or medals. He saw things no young man should ever see. Villages turned to dust, friends lost in seconds, and orders that carried more weight than his own heartbeat. And still, he stayed. Because every mission that succeeded meant lives saved, families protected, children who got another sunrise. It wasn't glory he was chasing, it was meaning. Back home, his father never asked about it. When Ethan did call, the old man would say, "You still in that same dead-end thing? When are you going to get a real job?" That word, real, hurt more than bullets ever could. But he learned to stop explaining himself. After years of service, he came back, not a hero, not even a name on the news, just another veteran in a small town that didn't understand what he'd done or sacrificed. He tried applying for normal jobs, but most employers didn't see the leadership behind his quiet eyes. They saw military experience and moved on. He worked security shifts, odd jobs, tutoring at a local college, just enough to get by. When he walked into stores in his town, people recognized him, but only as Charles's boy who never made much of himself. He learned to smile through it. He learned to shrink in spaces where he once dreamed of standing tall. And still, deep inside, he kept his discipline. Waking up early, staying fit, reading defense journals, keeping up with NATO briefings online. It was the only part of him that still felt alive. Then came the letter. The kind that changes the rhythm of your heartbeat. It wasn't from his father or sister. It was from an old superior, a NATO official who remembered Ethan's work years ago. There was a position opening, a strategic defense liaison, requiring someone with deep field experience and cross-cultural insight. Ethan hesitated for 1 second, then applied. Weeks passed. Silence. Rejection seemed familiar. But then came an email. "Congratulations. You've been recommended by the Command Council. Please confirm attendance for the induction ceremony in Brussels." He sat still for minutes, then laughed, not out of pride but disbelief. For years he'd been invisible in his own home. Now the world's strongest alliance wanted him on their team. Still, he didn't tell anyone, not even his father. Because deep down, he didn't want validation. He wanted peace. He thought, maybe someday Dad will just see who I really became. That someday arrived sooner and harsher than he ever expected. When his sister Lily announced her wedding, Ethan promised he'd be there. He even took leave early, planned a small gift, and wore his old gray suit, the one his mom had once said made him look steady. He didn't need to outshine anyone. He just wanted to celebrate his sister's happiness. But family has a strange way of remembering the wrong things. His father hadn't changed, only grown more bitter, more proud. To him, Ethan's silence still looked like failure, and so, at the wedding, the same pattern repeated, the whispers, the smirks, the reminders of how unsuccessful Ethan was. And yet, he didn't lash out. He didn't correct them. He just stood there, calm, polite, steady, because deep down, he knew something they didn't. Sometimes the loudest person in the room is the weakest, and sometimes the one everyone overlooks is the only one holding the world together. But what none of them realized that night was that the very forces shaping international security, NATO itself, had already recognized the quiet man they mocked. A recognition that was about to break the walls of that wedding hall and flip every perception upside down. Ethan Cole's life had always been a balancing act between humility and pride, between being underestimated and quietly proving everyone wrong. But even the calmest men have moments when fate forces them to choose, stay silent, or finally step forward. That moment came on a cold January morning, 6 months before his sister's wedding. He'd been working part-time as a security consultant for a private defense firm in Washington, D.C. The pay wasn't glamorous, but it kept him afloat. His official title was vague enough to sound unimportant. Field analyst, they called it, though what he actually did was much deeper. He reviewed threat reports, advised small NATO units, and wrote analytical briefs that shaped tactical responses across Europe. Most of the higher-ups didn't even know his name. He was the ghostwriter behind strategies that others got medals for. Until one day, an email thread crossed his desk by mistake. A routine coordination message marked internal use only. He almost deleted it. But one attachment caught his eye. Regional Logistics and Risk Data, Eastern Europe. It looked harmless. Until he saw the numbers, supplies marked delivered that never arrived. Training grants marked approved but never funded. And signatures, familiar ones, from officers he once served with. Men he trusted. Someone was moving money, not a few thousand, but millions, under the disguise of humanitarian support. At first, he didn't want to believe it. He thought it must have been an accounting glitch. But the deeper he went, the clearer it became. Someone inside the chain was bleeding NATO resources into private hands. He printed nothing, downloaded nothing, just memorized the pattern, like he used to memorize coordinates during missions. That night, he didn't sleep. His small apartment was filled with silence, broken only by the hum of the heater. He sat there thinking, do I report this? Or do I walk away and keep my job? Because he knew the cost of speaking up. Whistleblowers don't get medals. They get destroyed quietly. The next morning, he called his mentor, Colonel Briggs, a retired NATO officer who had once led Ethan's unit overseas. Briggs had been one of the few who saw the real Ethan, disciplined, cautious, moral to the core. Ethan explained everything in calm detail. There was silence on the other end. Then Briggs said softly, "Son, you realize what you're walking into?" "I do," Ethan said. "And you still plan to walk?" "Sir," Ethan replied, "I didn't wear that uniform to look the other way." Briggs sighed. "All right. You send me what you have. Quietly. Let me handle the rest." That was the start of something much bigger than either of them imagined. Within weeks, the quiet investigation snowballed. More data surfaced, more signatures. And eventually, NATO's Internal Affairs Division got involved. Ethan's name wasn't public, but in the confidential chain, his report became the backbone of the case. And that's when the pressure started. His boss began cutting his hours. Colleagues stopped talking to him. A rumor spread that he was being reviewed for misconduct. He'd seen this before. The silent war of reputation. "The system doesn't fire you. It isolates you until you quit." Bills piled up. His lease was ending. He skipped meals to make rent. Yet he never regretted what he did, because the truth, he believed, was worth the burn. One night, Colonel Briggs called again. "Ethan," he said, "headquarters is about to act, but they need someone to stand behind the data officially. If you're willing to go on record, they'll protect you. If not, you'll stay invisible forever." Ethan took a long breath. "What happens if I sign my name?" Briggs hesitated. "You'll be marked, son, but you'll also be remembered." That single sentence felt heavier than all his years of service combined. He agreed. Weeks later, NATO Command quietly launched an inquiry that led to several high-profile suspensions. Ethan's evidence, his quiet, disciplined precision, had exposed a network of corruption running through defense contracts. And in the middle of it all, Ethan's name started echoing in rooms he'd never been allowed in before. An email came, "Mr. Cole, you are invited to the NATO Command Recognition Ceremony for outstanding integrity in field operations." He stared at the screen for minutes, then laughed softly. The world had finally noticed the man his own father refused to see. But as fate would have it, the ceremony was scheduled just days after his sister's wedding. He booked his ticket quietly, first to the wedding, then to Brussels. He didn't tell anyone, not even his sister. He didn't need applause. He just wanted to attend, give her his blessing, and leave before the whispers started. But as the wedding day neared, he received another message, this time from Captain Reyes, a liaison officer handling logistics for the ceremony. "Sir, due to your contributions, the command has authorized full escort transport for you from your location. Expect an official vehicle from the base nearest to your town." Ethan smiled. "A military escort? That's unnecessary." "Not for what you've done, sir," Reyes replied. He didn't think much of it. He figured the vehicle would arrive the next morning, pick him up after the wedding, and head straight to the airport. But destiny has a flair for dramatic timing. The morning of the wedding, he woke early, pressed his gray suit, and stood before the mirror. For a moment he saw flashes of his mother's proud smile, of his father's disappointed eyes, of the long path between both. He whispered quietly, "This one's for you, Mom." The wedding was beautiful, a sea of colors, laughter, and celebration. And for the first hour, everything went smoothly. Until the microphone found its way to his father, Charles Cole had already had a few too many drinks. His words turned sharper, louder, meaner. And just like that, old wounds reopened. "Look at my daughter," he said proudly, "marrying into a successful family. And then there's my son, 33, no career, no family, nothing to show. Can you believe he once called himself a soldier?" Laughter rippled across the tables. Ethan stayed seated, face calm. Inside, his chest tightened. His sister looked mortified, her eyes pleading with him not to react. But he didn't, because he'd fought wars far worse than this. And in war, patience is often the most powerful weapon. As the night went on, people kept their distance, some out of pity, some out of gossip. He sat alone at the back, eating quietly while the music played and conversations flowed. Then, just as dessert was served, something unexpected happened. The hall's front doors opened, and 2 uniformed officers walked in. Every head turned. The air shifted. They spoke briefly to the wedding coordinator, who pointed toward the back. Toward him, whispers began. Ethan looked up, confused, until one of the officers approached and said calmly, "Mr. Ethan Cole?" The crowd fell silent. "Yes," he replied. "Sir, we're here on behalf of NATO Command. Your transport has arrived. We're to escort you to the airbase immediately. You could have heard a pin drop." His father froze mid-sentence. The officers saluted. Guests stared. And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't shrink. He stood, quiet, composed. But this time, the silence belonged to him. The wedding hall shimmered like a palace that night, chandeliers glowing, violins echoing softly through golden drapes, and laughter floating in the air like perfume. Everyone looked picture perfect, and everyone knew it, except him. He sat at the corner table, hands clasped together, eyes lowered to the untouched plate in front of him. His suit was plain, the same gray one he had worn to job interviews years ago. No one looked his way. Not even his father. Especially not his father. The man of the hour, his father, stood proudly in the center of the crowd, telling stories loud enough to fill the whole hall. People clapped, cheered, and laughed, until he began one particular story, the one that sliced through the air like a blade. He told them about his useless son, the one who had wasted his life chasing the army dream. How he had come back empty-handed, without medals or money. How even NATO didn't need men like him. The crowd chuckled. Even his sister looked down awkwardly, trapped between loyalty and shame. Cameras flashed as the father raised a toast, not for his son, but for the daughter who had brought real pride to the family. And in that moment, the man sitting in the corner felt something break quietly inside him. Not anger, not hate, just a stillness, the kind that comes before a storm. He looked around the hall, at the people who once called him a hero, now pretending not to see him. At his mother hiding tears behind her dupatta, at his father basking in applause. He wanted to stand up, to say something, but he didn't. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence speaks louder than speeches. Then it happened. The hall doors swung open. A sudden hush fell. 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the glass entrance. From them stepped men in navy blue uniforms, crisp, decorated, official. Their badges gleamed under the lights. NATO Command. Every eye in the hall turned. The father's laughter froze mid-sentence. The bride paused with her bouquet half raised. The music faltered. The officers scanned the room, then stopped when they saw him, the man in the corner, in the plain gray suit. One of them walked forward, saluted, and said something that silenced even the chandeliers. And just like that, the forgotten man stood. The crowd parted for him, not out of kindness, but out of confusion. His chair scraped the floor. a small, humble sound that somehow felt like thunder in the silence. He walked past the stunned guests, past the ones who whispered behind his back, past the cousins who avoided him, past his father whose proud face had now drained of color. The officers followed behind him with crisp precision, carrying a small blue folder embossed with gold. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Official appointment. He stopped at the center of the hall, right where his father had been boasting minutes ago. The officer placed a hand on his shoulder, and in front of everyone, read from the document. By directive of NATO Strategic Command, Captain Arslan Malik is hereby appointed Senior Advisor for Allied Operations. Effective immediately. The hall erupted, not in cheers, but in shock. The same people who had laughed seconds ago now stared like statues. His father's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. The sound echoed like judgment. Cameras turned. Guests leaned forward. The whispers began. "Captain! NATO!" He was in the military, and through it all, Arslan stood still. Calm. Unmoved. Same stillness that had kept him alive in war zones now shielded him from the chaos in that room. The officer gestured toward the reserved front row by a seat marked quietly with a blue NATO insignia, placed right next to the bride and groom. Everyone saw it now. That seat wasn't for a foreign delegate. It wasn't for a sponsor or VIP. It had been reserved all along for him, the man his father had mocked, the man they had overlooked. He walked toward it slowly, each step a lesson in dignity. Cameras clicked, phones came out, people whispered his name like a prayer they'd forgotten. He didn't smile, didn't look back, just sat down, calm and silent, like a storm that had already passed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then softly, the host resumed the ceremony. The music returned, but its rhythm felt different now. Careful, respectful, uneasy. Even his father, once larger than life, stood quietly in the background, eyes lowered. The spotlight that had always followed him now shifted, permanently, toward his son. In that silence, Arslan's mother reached over and held his hand. Her eyes shimmered, not with pride but with relief. For years, she had watched him carry the weight of disappointment alone. Tonight, the world saw what she always had. As the evening continued, guests approached him one by one, suddenly remembering stories of childhood friendship, distant admiration, or family ties. He answered politely, his voice steady, never smug, because this wasn't revenge, it was revelation. When the dinner ended and guests began to leave, Arslan stood once more, not to speak, but to salute the officers who had come for him. The salute was crisp, flawless, and filled with the kind of grace that only comes from discipline and endurance. He turned to his father, who stood trembling, not from fear, but from realization. The son he had mocked for not being successful enough had just been honored by one of the most powerful military alliances in the world. Arslan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence said it all. The drive that night was quiet. The NATO convoy led the way, and his car followed behind. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly. Stars scattered like medals across a velvet field. Inside, Arslan's reflection looked back at him from the window. For the first time in years, he saw peace. Not the peace that comes from applause, but from self-respect. He thought of the years of mockery, the rejections, the unpaid loans, the quiet nights of failure. He thought of how he had once begged fate for a single moment of recognition, and how, when it came, it wasn't loud or boastful. It was calm, pure, deserved, and as the convoy disappeared into the night, the words of his father at the wedding lingered faintly, not as pain, but as proof. Proof that humiliation, in the hands of patience, becomes transformation. That night, the man who was shamed in front of hundreds became the man the world saluted. The crowd would never forget it. Neither would his father. And somewhere in that quiet victory, a lifetime of pain finally found its purpose. Dear audience, If you're still watching, don't forget to hit that like button. And tell us, have you ever been underestimated only to prove them wrong? Drop your story in the comments below. The convoy that had stunned an entire wedding disappeared into the night, but its echo stayed long after the music faded. What remained wasn't noise, it was silence. The kind of silence that follows revelation. The kind that forces people to look inward. For Arslan's father, that silence was deafening. He stood at the gates of the wedding hall as guests left one by one, each offering polite smiles and words he couldn't bear to hear. You must be proud. Proud? The word stung. He had spent years mocking the son who, tonight, had made him the father of a hero. But Arslan wasn't thinking of revenge or triumph. As the headlights faded down the road, his mind drifted to quieter things. To his mother's trembling hands that had held his when the world laughed at him. To the nights he had walked home under broken streetlights. To the years of believing he was invisible. Now, for the first time, he wasn't invisible. He was free. Morning came softly over Mansera, sunlight slipping through pine trees, dew clinging to the grass like small prayers. Arslan stood on the balcony of his childhood home, coffee in hand, the NATO folder resting on the table beside him. He wasn't due to leave for Brussels for another month. The command post would wait. But his heart needed time to heal before his duty began again. His father came out slowly, no longer proud, no longer loud, just human. The man who once mocked him now avoided his gaze, unsure how to speak. Years of ego don't melt overnight, but humility begins in silence. The two men stood side by side, watching the town wake. For a while there were no words. Then softly, his father whispered the hardest sentence of his life. I didn't know. Arslan nodded. You didn't ask, and that was it. No dramatic reconciliation, no tears or hugs, just truth, finally spoken. Sometimes that's enough. Days turned into weeks. The story of the NATO officer at the wedding spread across social media, then newspapers, then television. People called it poetic justice. Arslan called it unnecessary noise. He didn't want fame. He wanted purpose. When reporters came, he turned them away gently. When neighbors came, he smiled politely. When relatives called to congratulate him, he answered with the same grace he'd shown in that hall, calm, unbothered, grounded, because true dignity doesn't roar, it whispers. He began visiting local schools, quietly sponsoring scholarships for students who couldn't afford uniforms. He donated his NATO salary to fund an orphan education program in his town. The kids didn't know who he was. They just called him Captain Uncle. His father watched, day after day, as the same son he once humiliated built bridges instead of walls. And guilt began to turn into admiration. A few months later, when the official letter arrived, embossed with the NATO seal bearing the European flag, Arslan's mother called the entire family into the living room. She laid the letter on the table and looked at her husband. "Read it," she said simply. The old man's voice shook as he read the words. Captain Arslan Malik, advisor to Allied operations, Brussels headquarters. When he finished, he didn't look up. His eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but of release. The son he had called a failure had become a symbol of resilience for soldiers across continents. That night, the father walked to Arslan's room. He found him packing. The old man placed something on the bed, an old family photo taken years ago when Arslan had left for basic training. Back then, the father had refused to attend the farewell. Now, he said quietly, "Take this with you, so I remember the boy I didn't believe in." Arslan smiled, a smile that forgave without words. Brussels felt like another world, cold mornings, glass buildings, flags fluttering in the wind. Yet inside those walls, where generals spoke in measured tones, Arslan carried the same humility that had once made him an outcast at his sister's wedding. He never mentioned his story. But some of his colleagues had seen the viral clip, the quiet man in the gray suit being saluted by NATO officers. They treated him with a rare kind of respect, not for what he did, but for how he carried it. Months passed. Missions came and went. He wrote reports, advised on peace operations, trained new recruits. Yet every night after work, he wrote letters to his mother. Not emails, but handwritten letters sealed in blue envelopes. He told her about the snow, the discipline, the laughter, the lessons. He never mentioned loneliness, though it was always there. She didn't need to know that part. Back home, things changed too. His father, once obsessed with appearances, started visiting the local veterans center. He began listening to the stories of men he once ignored, men who wore scars instead of medals. At family gatherings, he no longer boasted. He listened. And when someone mentioned Arslan, he simply smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. His sister, the bride from that night, often sent him photos, her husband standing beside his NATO-reserved seat at home, a quiet reminder of that unforgettable evening. She had named her newborn son Arslan Jr. The same family that once saw him as a disappointment now saw him as their compass, not because of his title, but because of his grace. Years later, when Arslan finally retired, he didn't return with ceremony. No convoy, no cameras. Just a flight home and a simple car waiting outside the airport. He bought a small piece of land overlooking the hills and built a quiet house there, one with large windows, open skies, and a library full of books on leadership, peace, and patience. Every morning he'd wake before dawn, brew tea, and watch the sunrise. The same sun that once watched him struggle, now rising on a man who had found peace. Sometimes, school children from the town would visit him. He'd tell them stories, and not about war or medals, but about respect. About how silence can be stronger than shouting, and humility heavier than power. He started a small foundation, the Gray Suit Project, named after the outfit he wore that night. Its mission, to help unemployed veterans and young men rebuild confidence after failure. The first person he hired as mentor? His father. The old man hesitated at first, then accepted. Every week he would sit with young soldiers, telling them how he once misjudged his own son, and how that became his greatest lesson. On the anniversary of that infamous wedding, the family gathered again. Same hall, same chandeliers, same laughter. But this time there was no humiliation, no boasting. There was only warmth. Arslan stood quietly near the back, smiling as his niece cut her birthday cake. His father stood beside him, leaning slightly, whispering, "You know, son, every seat you sit in becomes an honor." Arslan chuckled softly. "That's because you taught me what dishonor feels like first." They both laughed, a laugh that healed more than words ever could. That night, as Arslan drove home under a sky full of stars, he thought about the long road that had brought him here, from humiliation to honor, from rejection to recognition. He realized life had given him something better than applause, perspective. Success wasn't about the convoy, the title, or the seat reserved by NATO. It was about surviving shame without letting it define you. It was about learning that forgiveness is the highest form of strength, and in that realization, Arslan found peace. When he reached home, his father was waiting by the gate, not to lecture but to welcome him. The man who once shamed him now saluted him, not as a general, but as a father who finally understood what it meant to be proud. The night wind carried their laughter down the hills. 2 generations healed at last, because some victories don't happen on battlefields. They happen in hearts. Thanks for watching, story lovers. If you felt this story in your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more true-to-life tales of dignity, redemption, and grace. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments so we can see how far our stories travel.